Sucking on my titties like you wanted me, calling me all the time. That's fine. I pick the teachers and peaches. Bow, bow. Fuck the pain away. Fuck the pain away. Sucking on my pennies and I wanna be bumming me all the time. Did they do it? Did they impeach him? Did they do the impeachment? Did they hold him accountable? That's what really matters. I watched some of it. I watched the speeches. One, real uggos in Congress. Some of the ugliest people I've ever seen in my life. A couple of cuties, but by and large, beasts, hideous, just freaks. Also, just the stupidest fucking dullards. Just absolute, both sides, mouth agape losers. Just dumbasses. Like half of those guys look like panicky. They sounded like panicky auctioneers. Or like they recited their speech in front of the mirror for an hour beforehand and like were practicing all their stupid hand gestures. Pathetic. The losers, folks. The losers. But beyond that, one thing I did get is that accountability must be attained. We have to have accountability. The president must be held accountable. But of course, the grim comedy of that is that the job description of the president is that they are not accountable. If people who reach that level of power and that level of criminality, which go together, are accountable to the system, then why would anybody who makes up its sinews take the job? And they need these people. They need the faces. So that president can't be held accountable. The very notion is absurd. The very notion, it's like holding a hurricane accountable. Can't do it. The title is a Peaches reference. Yes, remember those? Remember her from the Bush era? But apparently, whatever they vote, and I guess they're probably going to do party lines at like 4 Republicans voting for, so it's going to pass. And then it will be taken up, I think, in the Senate by McConnell like an hour before the inaugural. So they might I'm wondering, they probably won't do it. At that point, like they're essentially waiting like for the thing to calm down. One thing I will say that I feel like I'm being vindicated on, for everyone who says, you don't know what you're talking about, you've been wrong about everything, is that they've already said that there's going to be 20,000 troops in D.C. for the inaugural. They're bedded out. They're bunked up in the fucking Capitol right now. So they're going to be polite but firm. You had your little tantrum. Now, how do you feel? Bad? Still? Well, at this point, it's tough shit. Tough shit. We really cannot afford to be indulging you anymore. Sorry. But of course, that doesn't mean the end of stochastic violence. It'll only be the beginning. And at every level, as I have said and will say, it will be encouraged by the state security apparatus. And what fighting fascism will mean will be backing the Biden administration as they extend the war on terror domestically. That's it. That's all that will have. Like this impeachment thing, you can argue all day about why it's necessary, but who is this convincing? You know, if it's about isolating the Trumpist rump from regular Americans who care about the country, shouldn't there be something for them to care about? And it's kind of amazing seeing people who have sort of laid in the cut when asked to do stuff about, progressive, actual, policy ideas, deciding that now is the time for symbolic action and that this is symbolically important. I mean, I think symbolic stuff is jack off all over the place. It's all jack off. Oh, it's going to let people know. They're going to see. Who's going to see? The same fucking web-addled dipshits who are already all allied, all on their own side, all have decided that, posting is praxis on both sides, or have decided that if they're on the QAnon side, they're going to bum rush state capitals because they have the fucking, the fear of God and the love of God in them that none of us have. Even if it's delusional and it's based on just watching too much TV. but it's a real motivator. Nobody on the left, like that's even a thing, has a motivation. Democratic voters are by and large absolutely cowering and holding the hems of every Democrat, because they're terrified of being of the Republican mob being let loose on them. And so since there's no left, like, symbolic actions don't mean anything. But it is interesting that people will say, symbolic actions, why are you wasting your time on this stupid stuff with Medicare for all? And then say that this impeachment, this is a symbolism that matters. So the thing that might, I don't know, drain the swamp a little bit by giving people an idea that there is something else the government can do other than punish people, now, that can go on the back burner. Holding the president accountable and reminding people about the fascist menace, that needs to be a priority. It's all going in a way that is very easy to see. I mean, if you can see this turning into this anti-fascism now, this popular front that we're supposed to have with the Democrats, if you can see that creating anything other than like Patriot Act 2, Patriot Act 2 electric boogaloo, literally, because it'll be about the Boogaloo Boys this time, then I don't know what to tell you, because there's no other forces at play. There's nobody in those rooms other than Democrats. And whatever the specific desires of any members of that caucus are, they're overwhelmed by the structural incentives of the party itself and the people who run it. And they kept talking about Liz Cheney as the good Republican. One of the most bloodthirsty neocons there are, the daughter of a dynasty of blood. I mean, caring about... I get why people want their feelings to be validated, because that's why they go online, to get their feelings validated. And they even get it in their head that, like, sticking up for the validity of the feelings of members of Congress is somehow an important thing to do. Because it establishes the stakes. It establishes how dangerous the moment is, as if our anxieties do anything for us but paralyze us. Give me a break. Give me a break. Break me off a piece of that Kit Kat car. I know people are being mean to me on Twitter, but they're all losers. I pay them no mind. And I certainly am not accepting any insults of my appearance, because I know that I'm looking fresh to death lately. I know it's all coming together. And yes, as many have noticed, my skin is dewy soft. So, enough of that bullshit. Let's talk about what's really interesting. What we're all here for. The Republic for which it stands, baby. The biggest chunk we've read yet. The second half of the second part. When the shit really hits the fan. When we get the great upheaval of 1885, we get the Haymarket, we get the Homestead Strike, and we have what is, in my mind, my favorite part of the book so far. And I've enjoyed the book a great deal. One of my favorite part so far has been a part where White carries out an examination of the political economy of the Western cattle drive. And that makes sense, since White's area of specialization is actually Western expansion. He's written books about the establishment of markets and political entities in the West, and a book about the railroads. So this is his wheelhouse. And so talking about the cattle, very, very interesting. And in fact, let's start just talking. I want to read a little bit from Am I back on? Somebody call my phone. I guess you're supposed to stop it, but I don't know how. Am I back? Oh my God, am I gone? I'm back. Okay, good. Sorry, somebody called my phone. So let's start talking about the stuff that's in the first chapter we read, Dying for Progress, which all boils down to a statistic that White points out, which is that throughout the 19th century, a time of America's rapid expansion, its economic its economy exploded over the course of the 19th century. The average American got shorter, and this is screening out recent immigrants from the benighted bogs of Ireland or the shtetls of Eastern Europe. Native-born Americans over the course of the 19th century got shorter, lived less, and had shorter life expectancies, and got frailer and got weaker. They literally got less healthy. They weren't thriving because industrial democracy, industrial capitalism was literally squeezing the life out of them and filling them with adulterants and gimcracks and tainted meat and rotten flour, and the food is terrible in such small portions, basically. So the whole rest of the half that we read is sort of reckoning with. It's about the country reckoning and the liberal elite reckoning with the fact that the smallholder democracy that had supposedly triumphed after the Civil War, the land of freedom of contract and individual liberty, and free labor, where the scourge of slavery had been removed, was not creating the prosperity, the broad prosperity it was supposed to. It wasn't recreating Lincoln's Springfield, which White points out in the beginning of the book is the model of Republican political economy. A small town surrounded by industrious farmers, professionals, laborers, yeomen, none of them terribly poor, very few of them very rich, many of them moving from one field to another, most of them ending up with a home and property. That was the idea. And then by the 1880s and 90s, you had a South where slavery had been reinstituted under another name, and the economy had completely stagnated. You had the eastern cities that were filled with just stockpiled with wretchedly poor immigrants. You had everywhere that industrial capitalism was being consolidated. In the railroads and in steel, you saw massive numbers of injuries and deaths. And terrible working conditions for people of all ages. And even those farmers who had been given the land with the Homestead Act and all that came after it were in many places struggling, especially in the West, where, unbeknownst to a lot of people, when they started moving people out there, oh no, once you get past the 100th meridian, it basically dries up and there's no water. And the agriculture that we assumed was going to be the basis of this economy is not really possible. And so you end up with this economy of railroad Ponzi schemes propping up real estate speculations that usually ended up with people going broke because you can't fucking grow out there. So one way or another, it's not going the way it's supposed to. And we talked about how the liberals kind of made their transformation. We're in the process of making their Kuhnian transition from mid-century laissez-faire nostrums to a more interventionist model. And I want to actually go to the very end of the last chapter of part 2 and read a little bit here to bring us back to where we were last time, talking about the sort of the ideological crisis at the heart of the liberal elite, who became the administrators the administrators of the bureaucratic state in the 20th century, and also the people who made up its media class, its intellectual class, and its political class, and who had instituted after the Civil War a easy peace on the South with the promise of prosperity for all, smoothing over all social conflicts. Well, wouldn't you know it, the opposite happened. Everybody's shrinking. They're fucking shrinking. Oh my God. That's not great. So, I just want to read this little bit at the end about how the economists who had gone from being, classical Ricardo Adam Smithians to absorbing German ideas, and then finally the marginal revolution of that would end up shaping the response of the bureaucratic state to democracy. Uh, Academics, here we go. Most academic social scientists held back as labor and vanguard anti-monopolists pressed forward in the 1890s, urging on cooperativist and state-based solutions to the long economic and social crisis. The academics, by and large, were not willing to join the assault, but neither were they willing to accept a set of liberal doctrines and social arrangements that they had spent their careers in overthrowing. Instead, they fashioned a new position, which emphasized consumption over production, corporations and large-scale production over competition, and bureaucratic expertise over democratic control. It was a position that some of the older liberals, whom anti-monopolists had opposed, could also embrace. It jettisoned laissez-faire, reduced the scope of individualism, and abandoned small government, but it left private property, capitalism, natural rights, and elite rule within a restricted democratic framework intact. So that is a perfect little capsule description of liberalism as we have understood it since the Progressive Era, which was that class of people coming to terms with the failures of contract freedom to generate the country that they wanted it to. But the basic premise was, because these were people in the propertied or near propertied classes who were around the finance capital, who were invested in the maintenance of capitalism, the assumption is all those Marxist notions, all those socialist ideas that, the real root of this is a class conflict, that we cannot resolve democratically the difference between someone who wants to work for as much money as possible and someone who wants them to work for as little money as possible. That is a conflict that can only be decided by force. And in a capitalist system, no matter what we say about democracy, that force is monopolized by capital. And they didn't want to change that, but they did want to keep it, if not more humane, more stable, because this is the aftermath of, as we talk about, the 1885 upheaval, which saw the largest almost like spontaneous eruption of strikes across the country, caused by the Knights of Labor basically getting in over their head, because as happened with all of the big labor eruptions in America and most other places, honestly, they were out of the hands of the formal organizations that they came from. The Knights of Labor did not want a full-scale confrontation with the state at that point. They were still they were still new, and they were still unsure of themselves, and they were still very cowed by capital. But they were in the middle of this extended economic depression, which all of the employers were using as an excuse to, even if they weren't suffering, their profit suffering, to reduce wages and control over work. And so how do we deal with this? Well, we get rid of some of this laissez-faire bullshit. We regulate the trusts. We distribute some of the profits publicly, but we keep the structure intact. And that has been the model for liberalism ever since. And in the section we read, there are two great examples of how liberal reformist instincts operate in this context, where there are people who are embedded in capitalist relations, find self-conscious identification with capital over labor, but also have the sort of sophisticated social self-conception that comes with acculturation and civilization. Being refined meant having some sort of, or more importantly than being refined, that's for the gentleman, being useful, being someone who could contribute to the public debate, someone who could administer a state apparatus, or work with a reform organization. I mean, what they prided on more than ever, and always have, is their own virtue. And they sought to affirm their virtue by solving problems that were caused by the system they supported, which meant that their solutions would always exacerbate the problem. And two great examples that White talks about here are Indian policy and prohibition. Temperance, as it was called back then. And he talks about how the allotment system, which was the single most brutal assault on traditional Native American folkways that was ever done out within the confines of the administrative state and the legal process, as opposed to just genocide, was a reform move. Yes, of course, it was allowed to happen and encouraged because it meant land would be allocated to hungry white settlers. But for the people who pushed it, they saw a future where Native Americans, Indians, would be physically extinguished from North America if they kept their ways. Carlyle, the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, famously said, "Kill the Indians, save the man." And for those guys, as cynical as it might have been, and as I said, it was only allowed to become a policy because it helped it helped the interests of those who wanted to exploit native lands. It did point to a real conflict, which was the native way of life was incompatible with turning America into the rationalized checkerboard of private property that we were going about doing. And so the solution for a good-hearted Christian Indian reformer is, well, make them have farms, make them settle down, make them farm and be like us, and then they can live as citizens, and we don't have to worry about them getting wounded knee anytime they decide to start dancing. And in the narrow parameters where the choice is extinguishment versus assimilation, assimilation is the more refined, is the more civilized response, even though it is in its own way genocidal. But that's because it could not, and its inaction destroyed many Native American communities. That is the end result of reform within a system, where the reformers are not part of a broader press against capital, but are within it trying to direct it. It will only compound all the contradictions that they're responding to. And prohibition, temperance is a similar thing. These middle class Victorian evangelicals were horrified by the drunken rabble of the cities, who the Irish Germans and Catholics, or the Irish Catholics, the Irish Germans, who would just get shit-faced all day when they weren't working, 20 hours a week or 12 hours a day. And instead of recognizing that the rise of saloons and the rise of drinking was a direct response to being hyper-exploited, which was an untouchable assumption, that to work to change that would be to violate sacred concepts of free enterprise and private contract. No, you just pass laws so that they can't drink. Irish Germans, like Tom Hagen. And there's a example that White gives of the reformers who are able to win temperance in Iowa, but then with a coalition of the more refined Catholic elements and the middle class Protestants, but then immediately as soon as it was enacted, lost their coalition's control because the immigrants they wanted to drink. And the response from those middle-class reformers was to say, actually, you know what? The problem isn't alcohol. It's the fucking Catholics. It's these fucking immigrants. They're not acting like we said they should. Well, they can't act the way they should. You act the way you are because you were cradled in the bosom of the Lincolnite freeholder America. You got in. You were there. They can't act like you. But then instead of recognizing that, because recognizing that would recognize the inherent contradictions within the system that you're supporting, you have to find a solution that only exacerbates the problem. And the thing that hampered all levels of reform everywhere, anti-monopoly, soft money, temperance, all of which had virtue within them. Even the temperance movement was a genuine attempt to reduce things like domestic violence. At every level, they were undermined by the fact that there was some segment of the population that was opposed for one reason or another to that reform, and that would cause the reformers, committed as they were to the system as such, to decide to condemn them as demographically and divide within. And that's been the story of America more than anything, is that our polyglot nature has meant that at every crucial moment of conflict, there has been more that breaks up the labor side of the equation, then brings them together. And now, and what is all this for? What is all this to defend? What are all these reform pretzels? What is Andrew Carnegie going, oh, we're going to give everybody libraries and they can go read and not be, sorry, we shot the hell out of all of your family members and are making them work 12 hours a day, but here, go read a fucking book. What is this system producing? Culturally, it's producing mass entertainment and mass amusements that are horrifying the middle classes, but are the only thing available to poor people. I mean, they literally want these people to have middle class tastes when they don't have the money of the middle class. They think that middle class means something other than, at that point, other than fucking income in a social relationship. They think that it's a state of mind that they need to impart, and if you can't take it, then you need to be kicked out of the country, basically. So it creates a culture that they hate, even though it's being generated by the logic of capitalism that they endorse. It's creating alcoholism. It's making people smaller and more sickly. And what is it making economically? And I want to read a little bit and talk a bit about what I was saying, my favorite part of the book so far, White's description of the political economy of the cattle drive. I'm going to read a section here that will be relatively long, but I think it's perfect because it describes the description of the economy of cattle investments in the old West, and the cattle drives from Texas to the rail hubs, is essentially the same model that you find at every juncture of finance capital and the physical economy in America, or any kind of economy in American history. Let me see if I can find it here. So, let me just start by saying the whole reason that the cattle drive happened, all those steers going up through to Abilene, was because Texas Longhorn cattle carried a tick that made them dangerous to be around other types of animal, because they had a fever that from the tick that they mostly became immune to as calves, but which, if the tick got to a different cow that hadn't had that, would make the cow sick, perhaps kill it. So Longhorns could not be brought to local rail hubs and shipped with other cattle, like domestic breeds that people brought to Texas. They couldn't take them to local railheads because they were not allowed with the other cows. So they would have to go basically around to isolated railheads that were sitting there doing nothing, because one of the marks of the railroad investment of the post-Civil War era is that a lot of it went towards building railroads that never saw much action and never got much traffic, because they were all speculative. White points out the railroads went first. In most of the West, it was not people showed up as settlers and then, oh, here's the railroad. The railroad went first. The railroad and the army went first, and then people followed. Now, in a lot of places, they didn't follow. Not very many of them followed because, oh, we can't actually grow anything here. So you had a lot of just fucking rail heads just sitting empty, and so that's a place you could take a shit ton of diseased longhorns to take to the east, and so they drove these fuckers up into Kansas and even into the Dakotas. And the thing that funded them, this was like the people who were, this was the single most sort of rationalized, financialized, and industrial elements of the Western economy, which is what makes it so ironic that the cowboy mythos goes around it. Cowboys were not sodbusters. Cowboys were not independent settlers out on the plains huddling in their cabin against Indian attack. They were employees. They were workers. They were hired by big firms to move those fucking cattle. So, and of course, the irony of ironies is that they had to kill all the buffaloes to fill this area with these fucking cows, which many of them were miserable, mistreated, died, starved in places that the buffaloes had thrived for millennia because they were domesticated, and you could move them, and you could ship them, and you could turn it into profit. You don't have to go up to one buffalo, shoot it, and eat it for a year. Texas cat. I'm going to read this here. Texas cattle gave an initial. This is page 595. If anyone wants to follow along, Texas cattle gave an initial boost to beef consumption. Beef from longhorns was tough, but it was cheap. The grass on the public lands, and for that matter, railroad land, was free. Always desperate for things to carry, the railroads touted the Great Plains as a place where cattle effectively cared for themselves. It spawned a separate genre of boosterism, pretty much summed up by the title of General James S. Brisbane's Beef Bonanza, or How to Get Rich on the Plains. Great name for a book, by the way. In the late 1870s and the early 1880s, cattle raising spread steadily north. I have to say, he should have just stuck with Beef Bonanza. You don't need the or there. Beef Bonanza is so much fun. Okay. By the 1880s, cattle companies and corporations created by Eastern and British investors dominated the Western ranges. And then he talks a little bit about how Teddy Roosevelt went out east, or went out to the Dakotas to play cowboy, and it was all made up. British and Scottish investors alone pumped $34 million worth of capital, declared book value, into the Western livestock industry in the United States during the last quarter of the 19th century. What attracted investors was an industry heavily subsidized by the federal government, a set of economic calculations too good to be true, and promises made by promoters that amounted to little more than a modern Ponzi scheme. John Clay was a Scotsman who remembered much of his adult life in the cattle who spent much of his adult life in the cattle business. It was, Clay remembered, a crude business at the beginning, and it remained so until the end. The subsidies, as with the railroads, were enormous. The federal government had opened up the public domain by evicting Indians, whom Roosevelt despised, and whose removal he saw as both inevitable and commendable. The federal government provided Roosevelt and other cattlemen with free land, and nature provided the grass and water that the cattle consumed. The federal government and states subsidized the railroads that promoted cattle raising and hauled cattle to market. For all practical purposes, the producer in this industry was the product itself. For cows and steers got precious little help from humans in surviving on the Great Plains. Their owners branded them, rathered them when ready for shipping, and sent them off to market. A fairly simple set of calculations made profit seem inevitable. Cattlemen calculated the price of maintaining a steer at between 75 cents and $1.25 a year. When stockmen reported they could sell a 4-year-old Wyoming steer for between $25 and $45, with costs, exclusive of capital and transportation, being between $3 and $6 a steer, how could they lose? If corporate reports were to be believed, always a dangerous thing to do in the Gilded Age, I'd say also now, hashtag Elon Musk, hashtag how is that fucking company still around, hashtag how do you not think that this is a gigantic bubble that is going to collapse on all of us? Tesla is one of the biggest, it's like Enron on freaking crack, folks, okay? Anyway, investors were not losing. Anglo-American cattle corporations produced dividends of 15 to 30% between 1881 and 1883. The dividends, as it turned out, actually came from new investments and loans, not profit from cattle. The corporations actually had little idea how many head they owned because actual cattle are hard to find during roundups. So to estimate their herds, cattle companies created a book count. Book count cattle existed only in the ledger. In an age that was perfecting actuarial tables and life insurance policies, there was nothing remarkable about making educated guesses based on the average survival and reproduction of large numbers of cattle, but men-seeking investors do not make good actuaries. In the book counts, the West was a land of perpetual spring and toothless wolves. Real cattle died, had accidents, and failed to calve. Book count cattle reproduced at a dependable annual rate, usually 70%. Book count calves matured and begat more book count calves. Western cattle corporations borrowed on their book count cattle, which were immune to the vagaries of Western life. As a Cheyenne saloon keeper told a group of disconsolate cattlemen drinking at his bar while a blizzard raged outside, "Cheer up, boys. Whatever happens, the books won't freeze." Now, of course, that whole thing eventually collapsed, but it was everybody was bailed out. You either lost, or if you knew the right people, you got bailed out. And that right there, that model, that is the model of the American economy since essentially its inception, but certainly since the Civil War. And it's the same thing as the railroads. The railroads operated on the exact same way. The railroads thrived on continued investment and gave investors dividends to induce further investment. Those dividends not coming from the profits from often unprofitable railroads that have been speculatively laid out for free because the government just gave them fucking money and capital to do it, but from more loans and investors. How much freight are you actually moving? How many people are paying you to fucking travel on your rails? Or how much wheat is going on it? That doesn't matter. Look at these returns. How many cattle are you actually moving to fucking Abilene? It doesn't matter. We have them right here. And all of these have in common is that you have things that are common necessities, like transportation infrastructure, like agricultural production, that are established through direct government intervention, clearing the land, providing, in a real sense, the capital, and then private actors whose proximity to the interaction, to the transaction, is luck in the sense that it is personal relationships. It's not fucking wisdom and vision and genius. Are then able to essentially act as ticks, creating fake propaganda and fraudulent book keeping to keep a flow of investor money in as long as they can, paying themselves as much as possible until the thing falls apart. That's the fucking housing crisis. That's Netflix. Netflix's numbers, 70 million people watch The King's Gambit. That's like the fucking cattle. That's exactly like, I've got 500 head of cattle headed to Abilene. Look at this. Look at these notes. Look at the ledger. So social forces produce industries, and then the product of them is kept and privatized, because at the end of the day, they don't trust us with it, and nor should they. And of course, they say the reason you can't trust people with it is because they're a bunch of uncultured swine who will spend it all on booze. Some of them are, but the one thing that is definitely sure is that if there is worker control of their actual, like, the capital they work with, as opposed to just a wage, the superfluidity of the capitalist becomes very, very quickly and very readily apparent. And that is the last thing any of these people want. And one of the signs that the working class uprisings that you saw with the 77 strikes, with the Haymarket and the 8-hour day movement and Homestead were being met with enough brutality, enough unified violence, and enough resistance at the highest levels of both parties. Because as much as you have this efflorescence of anti-monopolists in both parties, and he talks about the budding populist party emerging out of Kansas and moving through the country and challenging Republicans and Democrats in the North and South. By the late 1880s, the demands of labor, symbolized by the American Federation of Labor and Samuel Gompers, that had emerged as sort of an umbrella organization of the emerging labor unions, moved away from demands for control of workplaces and towards wages, towards consumption. Okay, we cannot be owners of the means of production because you will kill us if we try to do that, and we're not unified enough to fight you and win. What we can do is, especially since it's good for the damn economy, is get more of the surplus in the form of wages, which we can then spend at our discretion. We can become consumers. And that's what they became. That's what they are now. That is why so much of the hair splitting about who counts as working class is incredibly tedious and pointless. And honestly, I think it's mostly about people just looking to sanctify themselves morally. Like, I think a lot of people who go to college to learn about things like class oppression filter a lot of this stuff through a middle class morality, and they hear working class and they think good, and they think anything else is, oh, those are the bad exploiters. And so you have all these people insisting I'm working class. Like, well, maybe in terms of your relationship to means of production, but the reason that was supposed to matter in the Marxist conception is that people in those relationships generated social relationships with each other and generated class consciousness out of that. We're in a situation where we have 330 million consumers. Nobody has a class character. And so seeing people argue about it is very baffling unless you realize, oh, they're just trying to have someone validate that they're good people. Yeah, I saw that Hispanics and young people believe in QAnon the most. And of course they do, because they have not invested in any of the bullshit that we tell ourselves about this country. What I mean by that is, I mean like that these institutions have like a sacredness to them in themselves. Like a lot of the Q people, they imagine that there is, some America, some ideal America that they're representing. But the actual institutions of government and media to them are this disgusting corruption of that. And that is a reasonable thing to think. If you're just observing the world, you turn on the TV and there are all of the major tech companies and every awful giant corporation telling you that Donald Trump is a bad man and he has to be stopped and he's not American and stuff. Oh, and by the way, here's you're not getting anything. You are left to the devices of the market. Good luck in the middle of a pandemic. There's nothing for you. But you're supposed to care about this stuff, and you're supposed to be concerned about America's democracy as though it has ever done anything for you. As though it has ever done anything for you. I think QAnon started with boomers. You saw that in the early stuff, but it's a different thing now. I don't think it's the same thing. I think that those first generation of popularizers were Facebook grandmas, but once it became viral, once it became just a shortcut for the system is filled with criminal lizard pedophiles, which is a sensational narrative hook for any young person who's disengaged from politics but is aware that the world they live in is fucked. And also that it's a good way to get paid. Like that's the other thing, is that the original like QAnon conceptions and like the original proofing and stuff I think was done by a bunch of housebound old people. But once it hit TikTok, once it hit social like young people media, it could be something that could be turned into a hustle. And all of us are looking for a hustle. Every one of us, because that's the only escape route. Unless you have the money, unless you're sitting on some of that fucking hoarded cash from the mid-century bonanza, if you are even the child, like not, and I'm not saying working class, like maybe not a boat ownership dealer, but the boat ownership dealer's like second son. The boat ownership dealer's second son, especially since that boat ownership probably doesn't make as much money as it used to, and it's probably got a bunch of fucking leveraging. You're not getting anything. Nobody is getting anything, and no jobs have any kind of promise of stability or certainly stability at all, let alone the kind of creative satisfaction that the knowledge economy was supposed to provide to labor for people who went to school and learned. There's nothing. There's fucking there's gig economy gerbil work, unless you can monetize your own self somehow, like I have. I'm a perfect example. And like the Bernie thing was essentially a Q-esque phenomenon in that sense, in that it provided a common vocabulary for alienated people online to talk with, and then to talk to each other, and then to promote each other. And Q is the same thing. I'm not hammered. This is my first beer. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to talk about from this section. I did like the detail where he points out that when Teddy Roosevelt went out to Dakota after his wife and his mom died on the same day in his house, that he bought a gold-mounted Bowie knife from Tiffany and Company. TR really was a Trump type in that he was a tough guy who people thought was a tough guy, but who was actually a fancy lad. But the difference between the late 19th century and the early 21st is the difference between having to actually do something to think of yourself as a tough guy and just telling everybody that you're a tough guy. That does the work. Wisconsinites are built differently. Oh, I wanted to quote this little ditty that nativists in Massachusetts said. The Irish and the Dutch, they don't amount to much, for the Micks have their whiskey and the Germans guzzle the beer, and all we Americans wish they had never come here. I have to say, not very catchy. Pretty bad. It's a reason that those people did not really make any culture. The middle-class Protestant American beef with the Catholic urban immigrants was that they didn't have culture. But they were the only ones who had culture. Like, that American middlebrow was nothing. Oh, yes, I wanted to bring up good old Frederick Taylor, the founder of Taylorism and scientific management of work movements, who brought mechanization to the actual act of performing work. Human mechanization. People probably know a little bit about Taylor, but I think what's most interesting about him is that he was a laborer. He was a foreman, basically. He essentially made his own job. He created the idea of being a mechanical engineer out of nothing. He just bullshitted it. And that's how, when we talk about the formation of, the bureaucratic class that interposes itself between, the purely exploited worker and the capitalist, a lot of them are, these men of letters like Howell that White talks about, but some of them are eager working class strivers who just hustle their way to bluffing people into thinking that they have a certain expertise. And as long as that expertise can be profitably sold to capital, it will have value. And Taylor, no matter how spotty and non-existent the scientific basis for any of his theories was, he was able, like Edison and other people, he was able to sell himself to capitalists because he was selling them something they wanted to hear. And here was a guy who got to go from the factory floor to a nice office because essentially he made his own job with bullshit. And that was a big part of building that middle strata. Okay. They talk a little bit about I want to talk a little bit about the Knights of Labor. So the Knights of Labor were like the first. Before the AFL. They were the first attempt to create an umbrella organization for workers that would be able to coordinate across geography and across industries. And they were not modeled on labor unions, really. They were modeled on originally the Knights of Labor were modeled on the fraternal orders, like the Freemasons and the Oddfellows that were blowing up in America to fill in the gap of that social connection that they didn't have here, and that a lot of them had in Europe. And the Knights of Labor were a explicitly working class fraternal order that over time was able to do things like collect money for strike funds and coordinate action and move against workers and assert workers' prerogatives. But it was this jerry-rigged system, and its apogee and then fall came at the same time, which is that it precipitated the great 1885 railroad strikes, and then it was once those were broken, it sort of was on a slow decline and eventually was supplanted by the AFL. Good old Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers. We love to hear about Samuel Gompers. One of those names I remember writing down in my book in like 9th grade history. I thought about this a while ago, that there are certain things that I just get stuck in my head from learning American history. Never, and because you don't learn what's going on or why. You just learn discrete events that you're supposed to memorize. It's the worst way to teach the subject, and it's the reason most people hate history. And I don't think anybody in power is unhappy with that turn of events. But I remember Samuel Gompers, Zimmerman telegram, the XYZ affair. Wilmot Proviso, absolutely. The Gadsden Purchase. That's another one. Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome is so funny. Teapot Dome is hilarious. The 1920s were an incredibly important period in American history. I mean, it set the stage for a catastrophic economic collapse and then the reforging of a new political economy out of the wreckage of it. It had the Prohibition. It had the rise of gangsters. It had all this stuff. The only thing you learn about from the political strata of that era is some fucking assholes siphoning some oil out of a hole in the ground. That's it. Which in like in the panoply of corruption, one of a very low tier thing. I mean, like, I hate talking about like Trump as some horrible crook, because they're all crooks, but Trump's personal corruption dwarfs anything like that. And yet, Teapot Dome. Because you gotta talk about something, right? And you can't talk about any of the actual stuff going on, like the fact that the Klan took over half the country and ran like the state of Indiana, for example. Seward's Folly is a good one. Seward's Folly is a good one. The Cross of Gold speech. William Jennings Bryan. But if you're anything like me and you went to public school, when you learned history, it was just a collection of these things that you just had to remember. Why any of them happened, what connection any of them had to each other, it was all vague to non-existent. Sinners in the hands of an angry God, absolutely. Oh, you got to talk about Jonathan Edwards. If you have a milkshake, and I have a milkshake, and I have a long straw, here it is. I go across the room into your milkshake. I drink your milkshake. Still my favorite scene in movie history. I drink it up. I drink the blood of lamb from Bandy's tract. All right, let's see if there's anything else I want to talk about here. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So for the next Wednesday, we're going to finish it. Next Wednesday, we're going to read part 3, which is the last part. We're going to go through, presumably, the Pullman strike, the second Cleveland administration, and the fact that Cleveland let another economic collapse happen and did nothing. The Democrat broke the Pullman strike and then refused to provide any aid to suffering people. Because at that point, it's baffling. It's amazing, and it reminds you. It's not baffling, really. It shows how over time the party system exists essentially to mask the confluence of interests at the top of both parties, and they were divided sectionally for a good chunk of America's history. After the Civil War, the divide was regional. It was not ideological. The parties had basically the same structure in many ways, regardless of the fact they had different demographics of support. At the base, you had a variety of people, including I would say by this period in time, I would say the base of both parties is composed of people who are in favor of anti-monopoly action, soft money to increase the currency supply, and increase and help the position of debtors, But at the top were hard money men. Maybe the only real difference, the only actual issue difference between the two, besides of course the administration of voting in the South, was um, tariff, was the fucking tariff, was industrial policy. But in both cases, the preference for one or the other was not driven from the bottom up. It was driven by the interests of the top, which at that time were still divergent because of the regional differences. Because all that finance capital, and specifically all of that industrial capital that needed the tariff to maintain, to protect it from foreign competition, was in the North. I find that I'm always learning new stuff. Like I obviously am fairly familiar with this period of time, but reading this book, a lot of things pop up. Like because people are always going to find interesting and fun and insightful juxtapositions that you wouldn't otherwise know, even if you have a general understanding. Also, you get great names. Like in this section, there's a discussion of a corrupt Indian agent, which is of course a redundancy, named Valentine McGillicuddy. Wonderful 19th century name. And what's and that reminds me of one more. The last thing I want to say about this section and the book and that era, reminding me of the Indian agent thing, is the fee-for-service model of public administration. The thing about the United States after the Civil War is that it had theoretically a vast amount of power over the continent, a huge amount of land that it had theoretically dominance over. But its administrative capacity to carry out that authority was limited by its undeveloped infrastructure over such a large-sized country. And part of that was technological. We just didn't have the ability to really coordinate. And so what filled the gap was self-interest in the form of fee-based services. If you were a cop, if you were a judge, if you were an Indian agent, if you had any role within the government as a regulator or official, you were not necessarily paid a salary so much as you were paid fees for the people who you work for. Which, of course, that goes against the idea of a public service, right? Because it should be provided for free, but that would not have allowed for the motivation factor. That wouldn't have not gotten people to do the work. You've got a bunch of people fleeing the authorities, for example, into Indian country from Missouri, like in True Grit. Nobody's going to go and get them unless they know it's going to be worth their while. And so you got to have bounties, and that logic extended throughout all of the administration for everything. And that, plus the spoil system, was the basis for like the wildly corrupt nature of public administration. But the thing about the spoil system, and as I pointed this out last week, which we're told, if we learn at all about it in history, as this was a corrupt, non-democratic structure, and that civil service reform eventually cleaned it up. In reality, the spoil system allowed the parties to assert some independence from capital because they had independent funding sources. Because the deal with the spoil system was, say you're like a bartender or a ward healer or a popular guy in the neighborhood, you get a bunch of people to vote for the Democrat or the Republican, you're rewarded with like a sanitation job or marshal or something like that. If you get a salary or fees, you give a percentage of it to the party. So it's personally corrupt, like you'd had to give money to the guy, your patron, but also it built the party capacities. And that was necessary because the stupid Constitution, by assuming that parties couldn't exist, ended up creating a vacuum for administration of elections that ended up having to be filled by the political parties, and meant that political parties ended up being a load-bearing member of a load-bearing element of a structure that was designed not to include them at all. Wild. And what of the consequences of getting rid of fee-for-service, and specifically getting rid of the spoils kickback system, is that the parties became even more dependent on large money donations from capital. Because who the hell else has the money to give a fucking political party? All right. So, let's do the last part for next week. Oh, yes. And also, he talks, like I said last week, Henry George ran for mayor of New York against Teddy Roosevelt. And he talks about that in this section. And it was a three-way race between a liberal Democrat who was running with Tammany support, even though he was not a Tammany man. Teddy Roosevelt running as a Republican, but as a sort of quasi-populist Republican. And Henry George running on a labor ticket. And the working class Irish who were the Tammany base, they liked what they heard from George. And the way that Tammany was able to win that election was by replacing the votes they lost to George with middle class Republican votes. Because they recognized the threat where they saw it. And that's the thing about Tammany and the urban machines, is that, yes, they were more democratic than the bureaucratic state that would come later, certainly. But they were still they were still structures that served capital and that got a better deal for their constituents, their clients, than the raw market would have, but that when push came to shove would coordinate with capital to prevent a real challenge to emerge to its prerogatives. So they impeached him, huh? John Morrissey. Yeah, I did a dollop episode. I guessed on a dollop episode about John Morrissey fighting Bill the Butcher. It's pretty fun. Third party when? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, honestly, it might not even be a party. We might be beyond that by the time it gets organized. But depending on the whatever, I don't know, man. But it's at some point, presumably, there would be a party expression of challenge to this dead conflict between neoliberal inclusive capitalism and white nationalist petty bouge temper tantrum, because they will only reinforce each other. And that, to me, more than anything, is why I have no obligation to supply any kind of rhetorical support for a campaign to raise the alarm and to demand a defensive line supporting every hysterical argument from Democrats, because none of it is going to go. You're saying, well, we got to do it. We have to fend off the fascist threat. Well, when will that ever happen? It'll never go away. The fucking Republican base isn't going to change their mind. They're always going to be there. And the only response from the Democrats will be hysterical clapping and punitive police state measures, because they sure as shit have no interest in draining the swamp by making life in this country any less miserable for anybody who lives in it. Biden today says we're not going to do a big reconciliation stimulus. We're going to go through the regular channels and work with the Republicans. And maybe in the end they won't do that. But it's the same scam. It's the exact same scam. These guys are a threat to democracy. These guys are existential enemies of the republic. Also, though, they are the ones who get to dictate domestic policy. And you will have to support that, even as it makes everything worse, even as it creates more yahoos, more people willing to commit violence on behalf of their fucking orange god emperor, more people violently alienated from society, willing to carry, it's not, people are worried about QAnon violence, and that's going to be a thing. Stochastic political violence is going to be just a feature of politics. But as I said, crime in general is up and going to keep going up because this shit is falling apart. The social coherence is collapsing to the degree there ever was any, because it was all held together by plenty. It was all held together by the promise of more. That's what kept people together, even though we never melded it into an actual national identity. And the answer to all of these is the only answer that liberalism can give is suppression. Just like it's the exact same thing as those reformist evangelicals trying to break up the Indian reservations into allotments. It's like we're caught in this death spiral. Global capital is unleashed. The only place for profit is at the expense of labor. Every job has to be proletarianized. Every person has to be proletarianized if they don't have access to enough capital. And you can either learn to code or just, if you can't, then you just have to take it. You have to take it and remember that this is a good country, and there's a lot of shows on Netflix you can watch, and that's only $10 a month. Those are your choices. And if you don't like it, the answer is going to be the fucking stick. And there's going to be a lot of leftists, whatever that fucking means, who are going to be cheering along the entire time because we have to stand strong together. Even though it will be the policy of this fucking party, these Democrats in power, that will make everything that these people are terrified of worse. I will never be held accountable. How dare you even suggest? How dare you even suggest that I will be held accountable? I mean, these people are... How is it... Like, the thing I was supposed to have been canceled for, where I said that the fucking Capitol is not some sacred institution. It's a goddamn... It's Baphomet's ritual altar place. That's bad because it lets them off the hook for the riot. How at this moment in time, with these democratic institutions showing themselves every day to be frauds, showing us every day that, in a class society, democracy is impossible. There is no such thing as democracy in a class society. Because one class has the fucking power, and they're going to exercise it. And your ability to influence them will always be channeled and reduced and dissipated. And you might get a little more pie now, but eventually you will be put through the fucking chutes into the goddamn slaughterhouse, if that's what the ledger says to do. And in this moment, we're supposed to be re-sanctifying this hollow ritual with meaning that it does not deserve? Who does that benefit? Sure shit doesn't benefit anybody but the people in the political class who are trying to keep this fucking charade going as long as they can. Like, the Democrats think that they have the whip hand now, at least in terms of public opinion. They think that and this is the important thing, they have no way of knowing because they're caught in the fucking bubble just like everybody is. Like, they can make fun of Q people for being delusional, but I'm sorry, if you're a Democrat, you're as delusional. You live as much in a filtered reality that does not tell you anything about the average sentiment or will to act in any way of the mass of the American people. And so I watched that debate and everyone's saying the American people are horrified and they want to. You hope that's true. How do you know, though? You're just going to bluff it and hope that enough ringing the alarm and waving the bloody shirt will discipline these people. But the thing is, all they want to do with that whip hand, it's not push policies. It's not, oh, here we got them on the ropes. We're actually going to institute Medicare for all. No, it's, we got them on the ropes. We're going to reaffirm the America's trust in our sacred democratic institutions, and then launch a domestic drone program to combat terrorism. I think you're ignoring the fact that some lawmakers were explicitly targeted and probably would have been executed if the mob was more lucky. This isn't funny. I mean, it's funny. I'm sorry. All of this is funny. If you don't think it's funny, then you should not be on the internet. My God. Uh, but like, was it terrifying for the people in it? Yes. What's really weird to me is people who insist that, like, we all have some sort of duty to affirm like the lived experience and emotional response of members of Congress, like their posters, like their other posters. They're other like online friends of ours who are trying to validate. They're members of Congress. They have more in common with each other. They have more in common with Kevin McCarthy and Louis Gohmert than they do with us. The Q people as the new anti-Masonic party. That's not a bad comparison, actually. Because the anti-Masonic party was a similar impulse. It was people looking around at the bounty of the American of the Virgin America, finding roadblocks to the advancement that they thought that they would have in it, and decided that that couldn't be in this land of plenty, that couldn't be in America with its Constitution and its founding heroes. It must be in this secretive bunch of people hanging around and wearing aprons and who knows what in their secret societies. They even had like their own like Epstein case, their own sort of or I guess Seth Rich would be better. That there was a murder. There was a famous murder of a former Mason who was threatening to publish a book exposing Masonic secrets in northern New York, which helped spark the anti-Masonic party coming into being. And the anti-Masonic party was part of that drive towards. It was a middle class movement, much like the Know Nothings ended up being, in the upper north of the country of the United of the northern tier. It started in upstate New York, but I believe there were eventually anti-Masonic congressmen elected in Maryland. So like up through the Mid-Atlantic region, but not the Deep South, and. It looked at horror at the Jacksonian democracy and the slave power that dictated it, but could not find any, could not put any faith in the Whigs as an opposition to it because it was filled with Masons. And QAnon is a similar thing. When you're just trying to make sense of this world and you're looking for bad guys, they're everywhere in both parties. Now, it takes a certain sort of American brain poisoning and essentially mental like suffocation to decide that Donald Trump is the person who's going to defeat them. But by the same token, why wouldn't it be? Like the idea of a lone hero stalking the halls of injustice is an American archetype, and it's built into the way we think of the presidency. Like you can go, why do these people believe in Donald Trump? And of course, he's Donald fucking Trump, but he's also the president. And we have decided that the president embodies something, as opposed to just essentially being a vessel for interests far beyond his personal ones. And that their adherence to the job is predicated on the understanding that they will carry out that will, and that their like self-actualization and will to power is more a matter of embodying the moment and embodying the interests and powers and constituencies of the moment than of shaping anything. But that's certainly not how we think of them. Like, how could we put that much emotion behind it? How could we invest so much of our sense of ourselves as democratic participants in it if that's all the presidency was? The presidency has to be some guy with a fucking anime sword who can cut through the Gordian knot of injustice. If he's not, why do we care so much? Oh shit, it's pretty late. Damn, I went long. All right, well, we'll see what happens next, won't we? Next week, for example, we will have all this. And also, by the way, 20,000 troops in the Capitol. So my prediction is still solid that it will be a orderly, if tense, transition of power. And then you're going to start seeing some people pop off. And then you're going to start seeing the fist of the state come to smack Whitey in the face and tell him, no, you thought it was one way, but it's the other way.